Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is September 12th, 2022, Monday, September 12th, 2022. I'm sorry it's been a while since I brought you some news. I was, believe it or not, completing a book. But anyway, let's get off to it. And we're going to start off with my favorite, which is true crime. And this is an article out of Eerie News, and it's titled Murder in the Low Country, the Murdaugh Family Killings. And by the way, those strange noises are my exotic birds. I can't help it. It's the middle of the day and they need to chime in. But anyway, on June 7th, 2021, Maggie Murdaugh and her son Paul were gunned down on their property in the outskirts of Islandton, South Carolina. In the months to come, the senseless crime sprouted more ugly heads than a hydra. Margaret Maggie Kennedy Branstetter, a graduate from the University of South Carolina and granddaughter of a barber, married Richard Alexander Murdaugh, a member of the state's most powerful legal family. They had two sons, Buster and Paul. Maggie favored staying at the family's 1,700-acre hunting lodge on Moselle Road outside the town of Hampton in South Carolina's Low Country. On June 7th, 2021, Maggie Murdaugh and her son Paul, 22, were shot on the grounds of their property known as Cross Swamp Farm around 9 p.m. Alex Murdaugh found the bodies of his wife and son riddled with bullets from a semi-automatic assault rifle and shotgun. A double homicide in the rural town is surprising, but not as much as one would expect, since there were whispers the Murdaughs, who've been part of the community for over a century, have a history of tragic deaths. It seems that secrets and sins have come home to roost. The Murdaughs have served as prosecutors and civil attorneys since 1910 for the Low Country's 5 counties in the 14th Circuit: Beaufort, Jasper, Hampton, Allendale, and Colleton. They've lived in the rural town of Hampton, where there isn't even a Walmart. Their law firm, Peters, Murdaugh, Parker, Elsroth, and Dietrich, lies 65 miles away from Charleston. Paul Murdaugh was troubled, and when he died, he had a trial hanging over his head for a felony boat driving charge in connection to a 2019 incident where 19-year-old woman, Mallory Beach, was killed. He was one of 6 underage people who bought alcohol with fake IDs. They went boating to an oyster roast on Pocky Island. Anthony Cook, Paul's childhood friend and Mallory's boyfriend, testified that Paul had argued with his girlfriend and slapped her. Soon after, he hit a bridge piling on Archer Creek, and 6 of them were thrown into the water. 5 of them made it to shore. Mallory did not. Her body was recovered a week later. However, Paul's unusual behavior preceded this event. A family member said that when he was around 11, he told his Aunt Nancy to go F herself. He was known even then for not handling authority well. Maggie spoiled her sons, especially Paul, whose personality hinted at the troubles he would incur when he was older. She was a homemaker who involved herself in all aspects of her children's life. Later, Paul's uncles would deny the family used its legal ties to protect him from the incident. There were accusations they had stopped Paul from being tested for his alcohol level. It's been reported that amongst Paul's friends it was known he had a drinking problem, when an alter ego called Timmy would emerge. This version, which had been around since 2015, was deranged and dangerous. He was known for shedding his clothes down to his boxer shorts. His friends learned when to recognize that Timmy was about to show up and it was time to leave. The family at the time of Paul's death was facing a civil suit placed by Mallory's mother. The family had just settled another civil suit involving the wrongful death of Gloria Satterfield, who died as a result of a trip and fall in February of 2018 in their home. According to legal reports, while she was inside the Murdaughs' Hampton home, their dogs caused her to trip and fall down a flight of stairs, which resulted in her sustaining a brain injury. The claim was settled for $500,000. Satterfield was a housekeeper for the Murdaughs. Documents showed that her death was not reported to the coroner, and an autopsy was not performed. She lingered approximately 20 days before she passed. Later reports describe where a document signed by a judge was found, affirming a total settlement of $4.3 million paid for Gloria's death. Alex Murdaugh did not pass this money on to Gloria's family. According to a resident of Hampton, the only one in the whole family to go see Gloria when she was dying in the hospital was Maggie Murdaugh. She had been a housekeeper for the family for more than 20 years. The Murdaughs, who were usually on the other side of the law, found themselves in a precarious situation where they were the ones subject to investigation. Alex Murdaugh's alibi was easy to verify. He said he was visiting a hospital where his father, Randolph Murdaugh III, lay dying. He passed away on June 10th. Despite the police looking initially at possible suspects close to home, there was no manhunt for a suspect. Optics being everything, by June 17, two brothers of Alex Murdaugh appeared on Good Morning America asking for the public's help in finding the perpetrator. Within a day of their appearance, police started to dredge swampland close to the lodge and a tip line was set up. It seemed that Paul Murdaugh had been getting death threats prior to the shooting. Apparently the family didn't think they were credible. Paul's paternal uncles claimed the victims had no known enemies. If you ask those around town, you're likely to get a different version of who could have killed Maggie Murdaugh and her son. Former employees, people they sued or prosecuted, there's several that could have been motivated by revenge. On July 8, 2015, Stephen Smith, 19, a gay man from Hampton, was found dead on a rural road. His skull was crushed and his shoulder was dislocated. His mother, Sandy, 55, said she had been fighting since then to find out what happened to her son. The New York Post reviewed the police file of the case, and it reflects where South Carolina Highway Patrol received at least one anonymous tip connecting a member of the Murdaugh family to the Stephen Smith case. No one in the family was charged or considered a formal suspect in the case. The two families, which gossips believe had a motive for the murder, are the parents of Mallory Beach and the mother of Stephen Smith. There's nothing like a murder case to air out a family's dirty laundry, no matter how well connected they are. Sources familiar with the family claim that Alex and Maggie were living separate lives when she died. She would stay in their cottage in Edisto Beach, and he was at the hunting lodge in Islandton. Alex Murdaugh was sued by his family's law firm after he confessed to siphoning millions through a fraudulent bank account. This was discovered in September of 2021. The firm also alerted law enforcement that Alex Murdaugh had admitted to hiring someone to shoot him in a suicide plot so his son Buster could receive a payout from a $10 million life insurance policy. The man named Curtis Fast Eddie Smith, 61, according to Alex Murdaugh, was his longtime drug supplier. He also happens to be a distant cousin and former client. The plot resulted with a bullet grazing Murdaugh's head. An unidentified couple told the 911 dispatcher, "We are on Salkehatchie Road, and there is a male on the side of the road with blood all over him, and he's waving his hands. He looks fine, but it kind of looks like a setup, so we didn't stop." Murdaugh told 911, "I got a flat tire, and I stopped, and somebody stopped to help me, and when I turned my back, they tried to shoot me." When asked if he'd been shot, he said, "Yes, but I mean, I'm okay. I can't drive, and I'm bleeding a lot." Asked where he was wounded, Murdaugh replied, "I'm not sure. Somewhere on my head." In June 2022, Murdaugh and Smith were indicted on conspiracy and drug charges. It's alleged that Smith received 437 checks totaling $2,413,754 from Murdaugh between 2013 to 2021. Smith would convert them into cash to benefit Murdaugh. Alex Murdaugh was freed on a $20,000 bail and entered a rehab center to treat his opioid addiction, which he suffered from for 20 years. Upon his release from the center in October 2021, he was taken into custody on 2 felony counts related to the mysterious death of Gloria Satterfield. In July 2022, he was arrested for the murder of his wife and son. He was allegedly tied to the crime via blood splatter on his clothing, along with a video that placed him at the murder scene. He was disbarred in South Carolina. In September of 2022, 2 men who are connected to the Walterboro Cowboys, a street gang, have been dragged into the Murdaugh murder mystery. According to one of the gang members, Alex Murdaugh runs half the drugs in this county. In August 2022, the grand jury indicted 2 local men, cowboy cousins Jerry Rivers, 39, and Spencer Anwan Roberts, 34, on charges that possibly involve being part of Murdaugh's drug and money laundering operation in the Low Country. Alex Murdaugh is now facing a total of 90 charges of financial wrongdoing that include drug distribution and money laundering across several counties. It's been discovered the operation was bigger than anyone suspected. Local criminal groups close to I-95, which has been used as a conduit for running guns and drugs from Miami to New York, are said to be involved. Members of the Cowboys claim they want to drag in the gang's name into the case to muddy the water. There's even a theory based on information posted on a web sleuth forum after the murder of Paul and Maggie that Murdaugh had a long-time friendship with Barrett T. Boulware, a fisherman based out of Beaufort. He was arrested in 1980 along with his father on drug smuggling charges, where 15 tons of marijuana were seized on a shrimp boat in the Bahamas. The charges were dropped in 1983 after a key government witness was killed when he stepped in front of a car in Florida, the state's newspaper reported at the time. Bull Ware, who died in 2018, sold the hunting lodge on Moselle Road to MURDAGH in 2009. Bull Ware co-owned several odd and out-of-the-way properties along the waterways of St. Helena Island, which would be ideal for smuggling. Access to the islands is only possible by boat. MURDAGH's murder trial is slated to start in January of 2023. The whereabouts of his surviving son, Buster, 26, are unknown. I don't blame that poor kid. Oh, he's not a kid, he's 26, but I'd keep low profile myself if I have this going on in my family. You lose your mother, your brother, and your father seems to be at the center of not only their murder, but God, what is it, a drug kingpin? That's incredible. That's an incredible story. I'm going to follow up on it. But off to the next story. This is out of Mysterious Universe, titled The Real Reasons Why Most Ufologists Are Watched by Government, Not What You Think. It's a fact that over the decades, more than a few people in ufology have been watched by the government all around the world. And there are more than a few of these ufologists who conclude officialdom is watching them because they're getting too close to the truth. Maybe on some occasions that's true. Most of the time, though, it's all down to politics, as you'll see now. We'll begin with the most famous and controversial contactee, George Adamski. As evidence of this, close to 400 pages of FBI documentation on Adamski now have been declassified. An FBI document of May 28, 1952, reveals that Bureau agents had a credible source who back in 1950, no less than 3 years before Flying Saucers Have Landed was published, had shared with them certain disturbing data on Adamski. The FBI took, and to this day continues to take, careful steps to ensure that its source's name would not be compromised. What do we know is that the FBI's informant claimed to have seen Adamski in the presence of a group of Russians in downtown Los Angeles, California, on several occasions in 1950, discussing politics no less. Unfortunately, the available censored papers don't specify where exactly in LA the meetings occurred or under what particular circumstances. Nor do we know who was responsible for the source of the story. Also, we have to wonder how the source was so absolutely certain that the group were Russians. Was he or she conversant in Russian? Did the source recognize the accent? Were they themselves Russian too? If so, what were they doing in Los Angeles? Of greater concern, however, was the fact that Adamski's followers, which reached 6 figures in numbers after his 1953 book Flying Saucers Have Landed was published, were hanging on his every word. That included those words which were relative to the way of the life of the Russians. The FBI file continues, quote, Adamski, during this conversation, made the prediction that Russia will dominate the world and we will then have an era of peace for 1,000 years. He stated that Russia already has the atom bomb and the hydrogen bomb and that the great earthquake, which was reported behind the Iron Curtain recently, was actually a hydrogen bomb explosion being tried out by the Russians. Adamski states this earthquake broke seismograph machines, and he added that no normal earthquake can do that. The FBI continued. Adamski stated that within the next 12 months, San Diego will be bombed. Adamski stated that it does not make any difference if the United States has more atom bombs than Russia, inasmuch as Russia needs only 10 atom bombs to cripple the United States by placing these simultaneously on such spots as Chicago and other vital centers of this country's. Adamski further stated that the United States today is in the same state of deterioration as was the Roman Empire prior to its collapse, and it will fall just as the Roman Empire did. He stated the government in this country is a corrupt form of government, and capitalists are enslaving the labor. It's no surprise that the FBI was concerned that Adamski was using the UFO phenomena to spread communism. Now, moving on. Now to the 1960s and the Aetherius Society, one of the most known UFO organizations of that area. Of that era. So far as can be determined, George King and his Aetherius Society did not attract the secret attention of the world of officialdom until 1957, specifically in May of that year. It was on the 26th of the month that an eye-catching article appeared in the pages of a weekly UK-based publication called the Empire News. In an article titled Flying Saucer Club's Probe peace messages from outer space, the following was revealed. Quote, warnings from outer space against Britain's H-bomb test published in a flying saucer magazine take a similar line to Moscow-inspired propaganda. The warning in a special issue of the magazine is being scrutinized by Scotland Yard's special branch, the origins of which date back to 1883 and which in 2006 was absorbed into the Metropolitan Police Service's Counter-Terrorism Command. It is suspected that a number of flying saucer clubs, and some spiritualists as well, are unwittingly being used by the communists. The warning appears in a magazine of the Aetherius Society, which circulates widely among flying saucer enthusiasts. Not only that, the Empire News revealed that George King had, as he put it, received a channeled message from advanced entities from the planet Mars. Its decidedly anti-nuke message went as follows. Have not the latest peace moves come from Russia? You and the West blame Russia and say it is necessary to make these weapons to protect yourselves from them. You and Britain are in a favorable position to show the larger countries the way. It's hardly surprising that a body like Special Branch would sit up and take notice of A, this development in the world of the Aetherius Society, and B, the pro-Russian words of the Martians. King wasted no time in contacting Scotland Yard, demanding to know why exactly he and his group were now under surveillance by government authorities. While given both the time frame and the climate, it should have been glaringly obvious. The authorities saw King's words and those of his claimed Martian friends as nothing less than outright propaganda designed to make the UK government look bad and the Russians look good. Gerald K. Haynes, in his position as a historian of the National Reconnaissance Office, wrote a paper titled CIA's Role in the Study of UFOs 1947 to 1990. It's now in the public domain thanks to provisions of the Freedom of Information Act. It can be read at the CIA's website. Haynes' paper detailed the history of how and why the CIA became interested and involved in the phenomenon of UFOs. Although Haynes covered a period of more than 40 years, I will bring your attention to one particular section of his paper, which is focused on the 1970s, 1980s. Haynes wrote, during the late 1970s and 1980s, the agency continued its low-key interest in UFOs and UFO sightings. While most scientists now dismiss flying saucer reports as a quaint part of the 1950s and 1960s, some in the agency and in the intelligence community shifted their interest to studying parapsychology and psychic phenomena associated with UFO sightings. CIA officials also looked at the UFO problem to determine what UFO sightings might tell them about Soviet progress and rockets and missiles, and reviewed its counterintelligence aspects. And you know what? Difficult to believe, but remember, in 1963, the United States had to worry about Russia, which had brought missiles to Cuba. That was 90 miles off the coast of the U.S. So sometimes we read this stuff and we think, wow, it's a little bit exaggerated that they were reading, into these ufology and everything, are they being friendly towards the Russians? But at that time, it was a different climate from what it is now. The Soviets then were camouflaging their secret rocket tests by spreading false and fantastic tales of UFOs. Haynes also noted something that is absolutely key to the story that his book tells him, particularly so with regard to the Majestic 12 papers. Agency analysts from the Life Science Division of OSI and OSWR officially devoted a small amount of their time to issues relating to UFOs. These included counterintelligence concerns that the Soviets and the KGB were using U.S. citizens and UFO groups to obtain information on sensitive U.S. weapons, development programs such as the stealth aircraft, the vulnerability of the U.S. air defense network to penetration by foreign missiles mimicking UFOs, and evidence of Soviet advanced technology associated with UFO sightings. One of those who in the 1950s took a deep interest in the Russian connection to the flying saucer phenomena was the late James Moseley, who died in 2012 at the age of 81, and whose opinions on George Adamski we have already digested. For the ufologically minded, Moseley was, without a doubt, most associated with his highly entertaining newsletter, Saucer Smear. It was a semi-regular self-published collection of Moseley's comments, rants, and observations on the UFO research scene. Moseley was someone who in later years focused just about all of his time and effort on poking fun at ufologists whenever and wherever he could. He did so in a very witty fashion, too. I should stress, though, that Moseley did have a real deep interest in the UFO phenomena itself, and a firm belief in it, too. Right up until the time of his death, What Moseley found out as he traveled from New York to California and back again was a significantly varied and entertaining collection of eccentrics, liars, nut jobs, and, to Moseley's relief, genuinely interesting eyewitnesses to strange aerial aircraft in the skies of 1950s America. Although Moseley was interviewed around 100 people on a clunky big recorder, which was no mean feat, the list of interviewees included George Adamski himself and Frank Scully, the man whose 1950 book Behind the Flying Saucers led to Silas Newton's secret recruitment by agents of the U.S. government as revealed by the CIA's late Carl Flock. Moseley's coast-to-coast trip was funded by a guy named Ken Cripping. He was a somewhat shady, dubious character who had suggested that if he, Moseley, would do all the research, then Cripping would write a book on Moseley's UFO findings. The two would then split the profits right down the middle. Sounds good, right? Well, for a while, yes, it sounded very good. The proposed book, however, did not materialize, at least not as Moseley and Cripping had originally planned things. No, it wasn't due to the infernal intervention of the mysterious men in black. Rather, it was all due to a distinct lack of interest on the part of just about every publisher that Moseley approached with his well-thumbed and increasingly creased and crumpled manuscript. Moseley was not one to be daunted, however. Years later, decades in fact, he put just about all of his old notes and audio recordings to good use in his hilarious autobiography, shockingly close to the truth, which was written with Carl Flock. It was in 1955 that Moseley, in his own words, quote, had fallen under the influence of a man named Charles Samwick. The latter was someone who, before retiring from the U.S. Army, worked in the Holland mirrors-filled world of counterintelligence, which included keeping a very close eye on what the Russians were said to be up to inside the United States. Not only that, Moseley was able to determine that Samwick had in some hazy, unclear fashion ties to the CIA's Robertson panel and once helped to bust a Soviet spy ring in Washington, D.C. Samwick and Moseley soon became good buddies, with Moseley somewhat dazzled and disturbed by one particular thing that Samwick had to say. He told Moseley, quote, "The Communist Party has planted an agent in every civilian saucer club in the United States." Now let's focus on the Truman Bethurum. He was a contactee who had a decade or so of fame in the arena of the Space Brothers. His 1954 book, Aboard a Flying Saucer, remains a contactee classic of its kind. Jim Moseley got to know Bethurum well. In the 1950s, Bethurum claimed flirty late-night close encounters with a beautiful alien space babe named Aura Raines. Tops in shapeliness and beauty was the way Bethurum described the captain of the ship. The locations of all the actions were almost always isolated areas of Nevada's expansive Mormon mountains. Most ufologists of the day very understandably dismiss Bethurum's tales as fantasies run wild and free. It's intriguing, however, to note the following words from Bethurum. Quote, "Two or three fellows who had sons in Korea and who read a lot in the newspapers about the communist underground in this country were convinced in their own minds that I was, if making contact with anyone at all, making it with enemy agents. They even went so far as to tell me belligerently that they intended to get guns and follow me nights, and if they caught up to me having intercourse with any people from planes, airships of any kind, they'd blast me and those people too." Was Aura Raines a figment of Bethurum's imagination? Could she have been an alien? Might she have been one of those enemy agents to which Bethurum referred? A Russian plant seeking to manipulate the UFO scene? Taking into consideration all that we have learned so far, we should not dismiss the latter possibility out of hand. On a related matter, it's worth noting that FBI records demonstrate that in December 1954, the Palm Springs Republican Club contacted the FBI to inquire if Bethurum might be guilty of trying to put over any propaganda. Now, with all of the above said, it's abundantly clear that government agencies during the Cold War were taking deep interest in Russia, flying saucers, and communism, all in one. And it was for those reasons that files were opened on ufologists by the FBI, not because of aliens. There you go. Interesting, huh? It gets more convoluted, you know, where, I don't know, ufology has gone from, those kooky UFO people to, maybe, and now even people in the government and the CIA are saying that they were contactees. Very unusual. Okay, on to the next article, which is out of the BBC. It's titled "The Mystery of the Human Sacrifices Buried in Europe's Bogs." The solid rounded object Andrew Mould found buried in peat at a bog called Lindau Moss in Cheshire, northwest England, put him in mind of an old-fashioned leather football, but a closer look revealed it to be something far grislier. We cleaned it all up and we knew it was a skull, says Mould. It even contained a yellowish substance, which he learned later were the remains of the brain. Finding human remains in the bog didn't come as a complete surprise. For centuries, there have been accounts of body parts turning up in bogs similar to Lindau moss across northern Europe. Peat cutting was Mould's family trade. Many of his male relatives worked on the bog, and Mould had been going to Lindau Moss since he was a child to watch his father cut peat. Mould had not read about these cases before, and he'd found it bits and pieces himself in the course of his work, but this was something new. So Mould did what most would and went to the police. It was May 1983, and for more than 20 years the Cheshire Constabulary had suspected a local man, Peter Ryan Bart, of murdering his wife, Malika de Fernandez, but her body had never been found. A body or part of one turning up in the bog nearby could at last close the case. When the Cheshire Constabulary told Rain Bart that a woman's skull had been unearthed in Lindau Moss, he confessed to killing his wife. It had been so long I thought I would never be found out, he told the investigating officers. What Rainbart didn't know was that the skull didn't belong to his deceased wife at all. In fact, it belonged to a woman who had lived some 1600 years earlier. And so, as the police closed one cold case, the archaeologist opened another, much colder one. In the acidic, low-oxygen, watery depths of the bog, bacteria and other microorganisms aren't able to break down organic tissue, effectively suspending biological remains in time for thousands of years. In the case of Lindau woman, as she became to be known, the bog had even preserved one eyeball as well as her brain. There are many others like her. Across northern Europe, the same process that turns sphagum moss into peat has turned human remains into bog bodies. These people were interred in bogs as far apart as Ireland and Germany from as early as 2000 BC, though even earlier bog skeletons without surviving soft tissue have been found dating from 8500 BC. Archaeologists suspect that there is something unusual about many of the bog bodies beyond their extraordinary preservation. To be buried at all during this period of history was not the norm. Formal burials were rare in Iron Age Europe, with the dead, often cremated, given sky burials or a range of other inventive practices. Many of the bog bodies were young adults, adolescents, and children who seemed to be largely fit and healthy. Some were naked except for a well-preserved piece of rope, a hat, or a cloak, and sometimes their clothes were buried separately from them nearby in the bog. Above all, many of the bodies had suffered extremely violent deaths. As the methods to forensically examine the bog bodies have advanced rapidly in recent years, the mysteries of the bog bodies and who they were in life and death are beginning to unravel. After Lindau woman, another chance discovery in the same stretch of peatland helped reshape the study of bog bodies in Europe. The discovery was made by a now familiar figure, Andrew Mould, again. The summer after he found Lindau woman, Mould was working at the conveyor belt of the peat milling machine when a dark, solid lump fell off the belt at his feet. We thought it was a piece of bogwood at first, Mould says. When he picked it up, it felt like the leather of a handbag. He showed it to his friend and co-worker. Then we gave it a little clean, and we saw the toenails. In the days that followed, an entire head and torso were carefully excavated, though on this occasion the Cheshire Constabulary solved no more cold cases. At the British Museum, the body was found to be that of a man in his mid-20s, roughly 5 feet 8 inches in height and weighing 140 pounds, who lived around the 1st century AD. What was spectacular about him was that he was almost killed 3 times, says Miranda Aldhouse Green, emeritus professor in the School of History, Archaeology, and Religion at Cardiff University and author of the book Bog Bodies Uncovered. He was given a very special protracted death by people who understood human anatomy. He was hit on the head hard enough to stun him but not kill him. He was then garroted, and at the same time his throat was cut. Why such a brutal killing? The excessive violence used to dispatch Lindau man points to something far more unusual than an ordinary murder, says Aldhouse Green. To understand bog bodies' fates, you first have to understand the bog in Iron Age and Roman era Europe. We see the bogs as empty places, says Melanie Giles, senior lecturer in archaeology at the University of Manchester and author of Bog Bodies Face to Face with the Past. That's not how Iron Age people saw them. They were taking fuel from the bog, cutting turf, taking iron ore. They were making tools and weapons like cauldrons and swords. They were taking sphagnum moss and weaving extraordinary things with it. They were hunting the bird life that lived there. The bogs were rich and productive places for Iron Age people. And then there is the fact that the bog is a borderland, somewhere between land and water. I think the bogs themselves are also very special because they are miasmic. They've got vapors coming off them which sometimes spontaneously combust. They can be smelly. They look like land, but they're not land, said Aldhouse Green. They were possibly perceived as being gateways to the other world and gateways to the gods. Even today, the raised bogs can be mesmerizing, says Ole Nielsen, director of the Silkeborg Museum in Hovgarden, Denmark. Doesn't really take a lot of fantasy to imagine that there are more forces going on than you can really see. From careful analysis of the surroundings of the site where Lindau Man was found, he was most likely alive when he entered his liminal environment for the last time, says Giles. By using Geographic Information System (GIS) data to map the bog, researchers have found that Lindau Man was buried in the deepest part. Maneuvering a dead or stunned person to such a location would have been extremely difficult over such treacherous ground. Because it's so dangerous going out there at that point, he's probably alive when he goes, says Giles. The details of his fatal injuries also point in this direction. The perpetrator was very knowledgeable about human anatomy and knew how to keep this person hovering on the edges between life and death for quite some time, says Aldhouse Green. When he was then thrust face down into the bog, he was still breathing because there is water in his lungs. Further clues come from Lindau's man's stomach. Painstaking analysis of his last meal reveals an underwhelming barley-based meal, possibly a little charred. The last thing he ate before he died was really rather plain food, says Sophia Adams, curator of the European Iron Age and Roman Conquest period at the British Museum. He's eating what they call a griddle cake. The late Celtic scholar Anne Ross, who did influential early work on Lindau Man, argued that this griddle cake, made from barley and partially burned, reveals something of his fate. Amongst the priestly classes of Britain in this era, griddle cake was used in a ceremony much like taking the short straw. People would pull pieces of griddle cake from a bag, and the one whose piece was charred and burnt was chosen to be a scapegoat. Other bog bodies tell of unusual last meals too. One Danish body known as Grabule Man is that of an Iron Age farmer who lived in around 390 BC in central Denmark. His last meal involved more than 60 different types of plants, mashed together in an unpalatable porridge of cereals, bitter-tasting wheat, and more than 13 species of grass. You've got lots and lots of seeds and plants from quite a wide area gathered for this meal, which suggests mastery over the territory, and it suggests that was being ritualized and represented in the sacrifices, Aldhouse Green. But there are all sorts of ways you can interpret this last meal. It could also have been a humiliating meal. Lindau's man's griddle cake meal also contained a telltale trace of another plant, mistletoe. Ross argues that this suggestion a connection with the ancient Druids who were known to perform mistletoe gathering rituals. Aldhouse Green points out that it was known in antiquity as a medicinal plant for nervous disorders, and it may have been given to Lindau Man to calm him and to render him more amenable to his terrible death. Grabule Man, too, had a psychoactive substance added to his final meal, though in his case it would likely have been anything but calming. Traces of alkaloid toxins in his gut reveal that his last meal included ergot, a fungus that grows on ears of cereals such as rye and barley. At large doses, ergot poisoning causes hallucination and horrific effects known as St. Anthony's fire, involving circulatory failure, a burning sensation, and loss of extremities from gangrene. At the levels found in Grabule Man's stomach, it would have had a milder effect. That might have caused him to behave very oddly as soon as he ingested it, says Aldhouse Green. It would have made him make weaving movements. It would have made him very hot. It would have made him cry out. He would be in the throes of an extreme psychotic phenomenon, and so possibly that was part of the preliminaries for the sacrifice. Perhaps the best preserved face from all the ancient world is that of Tollenmen, a bog body found in Denmark in May of 1950. Today, Tollenman lies in a fetal position at the Silkeborg Museum. Like many bog bodies, the bog acids have turned his skin a bluish-black color and his stubble and hair bright orange, though he wears a sheepskin cap that covers most of it. Every fine line, almost every pore of his skin is visible, and his wrinkled eyelids are closed, giving the illusion of a peaceful sleep. You can really meet this person, says the Silkberg Nielsen. The face is the body part that has most expression of the human body. And so this is really fascinating to meet an Iron Age man more than 2,000 years old that looks as if he could wake up at any moment. Aside from his sheepskin cap, Tolan Man was buried wearing only a woven belt around his middle and a noose around his neck. If he had any woolen garments on it, it would have been preserved, no doubt, said Nielsen. The bog acids preserve collagen and keratin, which are present in materials like wool. The hair is still there, and his nails are still there. Neither is there any imprint of cloth on the surface of Tolan Man's skin. We have really examined his body very, very carefully with microscopes. There are still many, many leaves of phagan moss to be seen on his body, but nothing indicated that he had anything else on. So he probably was put down like we see him. It's really, really peculiar to see him naked and with a cap. In all, Tolan Men's condition points to a ritual death. For the sacrifice, he was shaved and he was put in the bog with a hanging noose, says Nielsen. Leaving the noose with the body is conspicuous. He believes as even something as simple as a woven piece of rope had value and could be used again. It was probably left as a sign, says Nielsen. His task was to be put in the bog because he had that purpose. Whether he was a volunteer or maybe he drew the short straw, we don't know, but he doesn't look that uncontented. The idea of going willingly to such a gruesome death is a hard thing for a 21st century mind to grasp, but it may not have been so outlandish to those living through the Iron Age. We need to think of a world in which the gods were everywhere, so everything you do is associated with the gods, says Aldous Green. As such, keeping the gods happy may not only have been life and death for individuals, but whole communities. If you annoyed the gods, they would give you a bad harvest, or give you a pestilence, or the crops would fail, and so on. And so you had to keep them on side. Giles agrees. You're dealing with entities that are influencing your life, gods or spirits. There's something supernatural there that can be accessed through the bog, she says. There may have been an element of circulatory to the offering of people to the gods via the bog, Giles adds. As people were taking so much from the bogs, they seemed to have been compelled to give things back. Sometimes these things were cauldrons, sometimes there were food offerings such as bog butter. If you give up a personal life, that could be the very best kind of offering you can make. But while there is evidence that Lindau Man, Tolan Man, and Grabau Man and others were human sacrifices, we shouldn't assume all bog bodies were, Giles cautions. For some bodies such as Lindau Woman, there simply isn't enough of them left to put together a convincing picture of how they died. There are some bodies that show no sign of violence, and these people may simply have drowned, she points out. There are dangerous landscapes. People die on the bog. They die of exposure. They die trying to cross it. They lose their footing or misjudge where they're walking. Some of these would have been accidental deaths. Others, she says, may have been simple murders. Perhaps a deserted bog was sometimes simply a convenient place for nefarious deeds. They may have also been victims of suicide among the dead, who were perhaps placed there at a time when such deaths were treated with fear rather than empathy. The bogs might have been seen as the right place to put a dangerous body. Someone who has died mysteriously or naturally, says Giles. Some of that was to do with the church saying they don't want those people in its graveyards. Some of it is that the bog is a powerful place beyond human reach where those dead can be contained. Wow. Okay, but again, I always come back to this. Why, where did the idea that to appease the gods, you had to sacrifice human life or even animals? Why? I mean, I can understand that, if you had a rich harvest, whatever, but where did that idea come from of killing another human life? That's very blood. That right there. There's something there in that equation that doesn't add up for me. But anyway, let's move on to the next. This is out of Mysterious Universe. It's titled Cthulhu, the Occult, and the Lovecraftian Power Zones of Wisconsin. I have looked upon all the universe has to hold of horror, and even the skies of spring and flowers of summer must ever afterward be poison to me. That's from H.P. Lovecraft, The Call of Cthulhu. In 1928, author H.P. Lovecraft released a short story in the pulp magazine Weird Tales under the title of The Call of Cthulhu. The story introduced the cosmic entity known as Cthulhu, described as having the shape of an immense green octopus, dragon, and a caricature of human form, and as being one of what are called the Great Old Ones, which form a loose pantheon of ancient powerful deities from outer space, a sort of combination of gods and aliens. These Great Old Ones were said to have once ruled over the earth but had since fallen into a death-like sleep in which they await the day they are awakened and liberated from their slumber. And so would begin the lore of the Cthulhu universe, often called the Cthulhu mythos, which would go on to be featured in numerous loosely connected stories by Lovecraft, all set in a shared fictional universe. These are stories of cosmic horror, of dark cults, strange creatures lurking in the shadows, and beings so alien and beyond our comprehension as to cause madness just by looking upon them. Yet as much as this must surely all be fiction, there have been those over the years who have maintained that these sinister cosmic forces really exist, and Cthulhu has managed to seep into some occult beliefs, blurring the line between reality and fiction. One of the first to develop the Cthulhu mythos into an actual occult system was the British occultist Kenneth Grant, who was a close follower and student of the sorcerer and occultist Aleister Crowley, and who was one of those in waiting to take over from Crowley upon his death in 1947. Grant did much to reconcile Lovecraft's nightmarish worlds and gods with real ancient mythic entities, and was a proponent of the idea that Lovecraft's work was manifesting a long occult tradition that drew from a common cosmic source through the realms of dreams. Indeed, Grant pointed out that dream interpretation played a major role in various occult, shamanic, and religious traditions and experiences for centuries, and that they were all tapping into something real. In essence, he believed that rather than Lovecraft conjuring up these nightmare fantasies purely from his imagination, he was in fact channeling them through his subconscious and dreams without him being willing or even aware of that. Indeed, Lovecraft didn't even have an interest in such paranormal ideas, and was mostly very rational in nature, so he would never have believed any of this. It was partially this disbelief that kept him from crossing the abyss to become a true adept. Bolton K.R. wrote in the Irish Journal of Gothic and Horror Studies of this: Lovecraft suffered from an acute inferiority complex, which prevented him from personally crossing the abyss in his lifetime. He remained a withdrawn and lonely writer who retained a rational, skeptical view of the universe, despite the glimpses of places and entities beyond the world of mundane reality, which his dream experiences allowed him. He never learned the true origin of the tremendous vistas of cosmic strangeness that haunted his dreams. He never realized that he was himself the high priest, Ekpiet, the prophet of the dawning aeon of Cthulhu. Grant called Lovecraft a channel for cosmic forces of epical or aeonic significance, which had brought his consciousness into contact with an outside sphere of the fantastical, another dimension, the one inhabited by Cthulhu. According to Grant, he was a fantasy writer who could convey genuine occult knowledge via dream, tapping into messages transmitted to man from other dimensions, which had then channeled through his hand onto the page without Lovecraft even being aware of it. This meant that in a sense Cthulhu was real. One follower of Grant's ideas and frequent writer on the Cthulhu mythos by the name of Frater Tenebris would say of the objective reality of Cthulhu and others like him: although Lovecraft outwardly espoused a wholly rational and skeptical view of the universe, his dream world experiences allowed him glimpses of places and entities beyond the world of mundane reality. And behind his stilted and often excessive prose, there lies a vision and an understanding of occult forces which is directly relevant to the magical tradition. These stories and novels contain hidden meanings and magical formulae unknown even to their creator. These entities exist in another dimension or on a different vibrational level, and can only enter this universe through specific window areas or psychic gateways, a concept of fundamental to many occult traditions. Cthulhu is the high priest of the old ones, entombed in the sunken city of Rilye, where he awaits the time of their return. He is described as a winged tentacled anthropoid of immense size, formed from a semi-viscous substance, which recombines after his apparent destruction at the conclusion of the tale. While the shaman and the occultists will their altered states of consciousness, Lovecraft, a rationalist and materialist, is considered by his occult followers as what we might term an unwitting shaman, whose ability to channel the denizens of the astral or unconscious realms through dreams is as legitimate as a will channeling by the occult practitioner. It is all much more complex than this, but the basic idea is that these cosmic forces, indeed Cthulhu himself, were working through Lovecraft dreams, just as they did to the character in his stories. In this idea, Cthulhu is real, or that it had at the very least sufficient influence upon the psyche and occult value to be of use as a complete occult system, regardless of having its origins in 20th century short stories. The idea in Grant's writings on the matter inspired a number of real Cthulhu cults and occult traditions that treat Cthulhu as real and even practice a form of magic called Lovecraftian magic. And there have been those who believe that Cthulhu's lost city of Aurelia is a real place and have searched for it beneath the waves. The most notable of these Cthulhu orders is the Esoteric Order of Dagon, found in 1981 and named after the society in Lovecraft's story Shadow over Innsmouth. But there are others that are woven the Cthulhu mythos into their own esoteric systems. Lovecraft himself shunned such ideas, but they nevertheless took on a life of their own. Bolton, K.R. explains more on it. Lovecraft was a rationalist who eschewed any notion that his stories and the nightmares that inspired them had any cosmic or moral consequences. Ironically, Lovecraft's occult interpreters are committed to precisely what their unwitting shaman found contemptible in his own day, in those who invent or revive any sort of mythology and defy anyone to prove that it isn't emotionally true. Nonetheless, Lovecraft provided his stories with sufficient plausibility for seekers of arcane knowledge to enable them to weave a tapestry out of the threads he provided. Lovecraft's mythos has taken on a life of its own in precisely the same manner. Lovecraft lamented the emergence of such crypto-religious and mythic revivals in his own time. Not surprisingly, the mythos has attracted the perverse fascination of occultists who are drawn to the dark and chaotic sides of life and the cosmos. There are moreover sufficient hints in the Lovecraft stories around which an entire occult system of theory and practice can be woven, especially when synthesized with other dark forms of occultism such as those of Crowley. Since the occult, and indeed in the wider context religion, has since times immemorial been based in no small measure upon dreams, dream interpretations, and visions, often willfully invoked by the use of rituals or of drugs, it is entirely fitting that some occultists would conclude that Lovecraft was unwillingly tapping into the astral plane, or what Jung called the collective unconscious, where there exist many atavisms repressed into the subconscious since the dawn of humanity, awaiting conscious awakening. Whether one calls such archetypes gods and devils is a matter of semantics or moral relativity. The Lovecraft mythos is just as legitimate or otherwise as any other form of occultism or mysticism, and if it had sufficient force to impact upon the psyche, then it at least is proficient as any other, whether old or new. The Cthulhu cult is given a certain objective legitimacy by supposedly having extant remnants since time immemorial, examples alluded to by Lovecraft including South Sea Islanders, voodoo worshippers, and the Angagaks of Greenland, hence the present-day Western adepts dedicated to a return of the great old ones to Earth to assume their godly mantles, claim to be part of a living tradition that has long existed, the very phenomena Lovecraft deplored in his own time. Another who will pursue such ideas is the occultist Michael Berthoud, who is most well known for his study of Haitian voodoo magic, also spelled Voodoo, and his book Voodoo Gnostic Workbook, which is considered to be a bit of 20th century classic by occultists. Berthoud also found the Lovecraftian Coven, which is a branch of the voodoo cult of Coulever Noir and is led by a priestess of the Black Snake cult. Berthoud had correspondence with Grant and described to him rituals carried out at certain Cthulhu power zones during which he had actually made contact with the Deep Ones, an immortal amphibious race from Lovecraft stories that have strong ties to Cthulhu that when conjured by the Lovecraftian Coven were said to assume an almost tangible substance. According to Berthoud, these Cthulhu power zones lie in Wisconsin, of all places, specifically at Crystal Lake, Fish Lake, and Devil's Lake, and that they not only serve as portals to Earth for the Deep Ones, but potential lines of communication with Cthulhu himself, as well as other great old ones, such as the Shub-Niggurath and the Goat of 1,000 Young, also known as the Lord of the Wood, a massive monster full of tentacles. Berthoud apparently carried out elaborate ceremonial rituals seeking to do this, involving the use of paintings and statues of sea monsters, animal sacrifices, and arcane chanting in Creole French. Allegedly, the deep ones would appear and even fornicate with the high priestess leading the ceremony, and that Lovecraftian magic was magnified in these zones. Grant would write at length about these Cthulhu power zones and Bertot's rituals to summon the deep ones from the depths of lakes in the 1975 book Cults of the Shadow. It is all pretty bizarre to say the least. Is there anything to this? Could the lore mythology written of by Lovecraft have been transmitted to him somehow from realms beyond our understanding? Is this all fiction or something else masquerading as fiction? It is unclear, but it is all pretty wild ride all the same. You know what? I've read a lot of the Lovecraft novels, Cthulhu's, Thakwa, all of them. And there's something very clear about when Lovecraft was writing about all these different entities or old gods, he always portrayed them as evil. He always portrayed them as enemies of humankind. All right. And as a matter of fact, almost in all his stories, people or the, whether you want to call them the villains or the protagonists, who were followers of these old ones or kept their secrets somehow or other, they always got the short end of the stick. They were either punished by these old ones, or they suffered a terrible fate because they were followers of it. And of course, he does a lot of the family lineage things with either people that were the followers or, and of course, he had a lot of his stories portraying where, in other words, there was a species of humans who were amphibian based. In other words, instead of mammal based. In other words, really interesting, very interesting. But all in all, he never put a positive spin on all these old ones. None of the entities or gods or whatever in the Cthulhu mythos, he never portrayed them as beneficent or even beneficent even to his own followers. So he was pretty clear cut about, he's hats off to him, but he never made them out to be anything but they were going to be a scourge on humanity. Anyway, on next to the next one, this is Fox 13 out of Salt Lake City. This is titled Haunted Coffee Shop in Logan Brings in Paranormal Experts to Investigate. Logan, Utah. A Logan coffee shop brought in paranormal investigators to back up their claim that the location is haunted. Country no-nonsense coffee workers have no doubts that spirits visit their shop. I definitely believe it is haunted for sure. Like I said, with everything going on, it would just be hard to debunk it as fake, said assistant manager Gretchen Zitting. We would just make jokes about it like, oh, it's the ghost again, and just blow it off. But once I caught the growl on security, I was like, okay, it's something darker, something more. Maybe we should look into this a little more, said owner Sarah Avalos. The shop employees were so spooked they decided to call in the experts to collect evidence. It's good to get proof, though, so people don't think we're crazy, said Avalos. It's good to have evidence. The investigators say that they caught emotion light turning on with no one around to trigger it. Audio clips may supposedly contain a growl, the sound of an elephant, oh boy, and a conversation where they say you can hear the spirit gasp. Investigators also shared a video where something took over their computer screens for 17 minutes when their Wi-Fi was off. I like watching ghost hunters, and it takes a lot to catch something. You have to be there for hours, and they caught a lot in 3 hours. I'm surprised they caught so much, Avalos said. But the spirits don't stop the four walls. Don't stop the four walls of the coffee shop, Avalos says. They continue to make their presence felt in the batting cages right next door. It's always been interesting, but after we caught the growl, I didn't want to be here at night. I was just like, let's hurry, close, hurry, and get out of here because it's a whole different feel at night. The paranormal investigators joined with Avalos and shop employees in saying the place is haunted. Now, those who work inside on a daily basis are trying not to upset the ghost goblins or ghoulies. If you do show reaction to it, they will make it stronger. And if anything, we just really want to pass it on and leave us alone, said Avalos. I try not to think about it much. Country no-nonsense coffee workers say they're hoping to do ghost tours in October, but plan to stop after Halloween so they don't irritate the spirits. By the way, close by here is a location called St. Anne's Retreat. As a matter of fact, I wrote an article about it, which is it was originally the hatch right there in Logan, um, Logan, Utah, and originally the family that owned it. Here it is for you, for those of you looking at it. If you ever want to read it, And basically, a lot of weird things have gone on there. Now I know they finally fenced it off because it's privately owned. But in that area, I detailed that a lot of unusual deaths have occurred, like a high number of them. So it makes me wonder what was happening at the location where that coffee shop was at, especially if they've got stuff going on next door. And let me tell you something, the best thing has got to be that they heard an elephant. That's a first. That is a first. Okay, and off to our next story. This is also out of Mysterious Universe, and it's titled Demonic Hobgoblin Terrifies Paranormal Investigators into Becoming Ordained Ministers. That's pretty out there. There is an interesting paranormal investigation story making the rounds about what the couple involved described as an encounter with a hobgoblin that was so terrifying it scared both into becoming ordained ministers. Well, the incident happened a few years ago. They're out and about promoting their new book, and since no one seems to have been talking about hobgoblins lately, it seems like a good time to look about both their unusual story and conversion and the terrifying shape-shifting hobgoblin that drove them to it. The worst thing we've seen was at Wick Church at St. Lawrence. We had what we call a spirit box with us, which is like an electronic Ouija board, and Christine had a dictaphone. And we said, "Is everyone there? We don't mean you any harm. Please come forward." According to their interview in Whole Live, Vic Harbord and Christine Townend are paranormal investigators and the authors of Heaven Only Knows Paranormal Investigations from Around Yorkshire. The investigation they were describing took place at St. Lawrence's Church, Atwick, near the North Sea coast of Yorkshire. A quaint old church dating back to the 1500s, St. Lawrence doesn't seem to be the place for paranormal investigators, and they don't give a reason why they and their East Yorkshire Paranormal Research Group were there, but they were prepared for an encounter since they came armed with a spirit box to give any spirits there a voice and a recording device to preserve it. While in the church's graveyard, they called out that they meant no harm. Then they heard something that was not a voice. Quote, "Then Christine said, 'Did you hear that growl?' I said, 'What growl?' And the growl actually moved, and I walked towards it, which was a silly thing to do. And the others heard two big loud bangs, and we did a bit of investigating into it. And there's a legend that it's supposed to be haunted by a goblin. This happened in a churchyard. I took a photograph, and there's a head in the window that looks like a demon, to be honest." End quote. Before you ask, they did not provide the photograph, although it may be in their book. The couple also admitted that there were 6 other investigators in the group investigating the church graveyard, and none of them heard any growling, only the 2 loud bangs. That seems unusual because there were more growls. Quote, "It wasn't long into the investigation when I actually heard like a growl. The grass was quite long, but not extremely long, and I said, 'I have just heard a growl,' and I'm thinking, well, I can't have heard a growl, and as Vic's talking away to the rest of the group, I'm still thinking, well, I've heard a growl, and then I heard it again. I heard it 3, then 4 times, and after the 4th time, I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. I thought, well, this is ridiculous." Before you ask again, they did not say if they recorded the growls, and ridiculous seems like an inappropriate description of the growls since the couple admitted it was those eerie sounds that frightened them so much. They soon became ordained ministers. Have other churches which are suffering minister and priest shortages thought about securing terrified paranormal investigators? Just a thought. How could some growls scare 2 people to becoming religious leaders? Quote, "When you hear a growl, it's a negative energy. It's inhuman. It's obviously not very nice." Okay, inhuman definitely sounds scary. However, when the couple began investigating the history of St. Lawrence Church and Atwick, they found it had a history of being terrorized by an unusual being, a hobgoblin. Wait a minute. Isn't William Shakespeare Puck from A Midsummer Night's Dream a hobgoblin? "Those that hobgoblin call you, and sweet Puck, you do their work, and they shall have good luck. Are not you he? Thou speakest that right. I am that merry wanderer of the night." That's from A Midsummer's Night Dream by William Shakespeare. And as you can tell, me reading Shakespeare is not good. But anyway, the folklore of hobgoblins dates back to at least the 1500s, and they were considered to be helpful and friendly household spirits or elves. Puck or Robin Goodfellow was a mischievous fairy or sprite, rather than evil like regular goblins. Hob means elf. It is believed that the reputation of hobgoblins became more evil due to the spread of Christianity. Some of the more famous folklore hobgoblins were evil. Blue Birches was a shapeshifter. Robin Roundcap was blamed for accidents in barns, and the hobgoblins known as Dobby in Lancashire and Yorkshire were said to be pranksters. Doing research for their book, Townsend learned that hobgoblins were believed to be able to shapeshift, which led her to believe that they may have encountered one in the graveyard, shapeshifting into a growling creature and then into a demon. Still to this day, we're not 100% sure what we encountered. When you start thinking about all this folklore from years ago, you start to think, well, is it true? Is there some truth in this folklore? Sure, there may be some truth to the folklore, but a growling demonic hobgoblin? That doesn't really fit in the midst of hobgoblins. As a couple showed their photo and told their story, other paranormal investigators thought they saw something far worse. It looked half dog, half human, something horrible anyway. After a lot of studies, we decided that it was a face. When you study it, this face is stood in the church because it is behind the stained glass of the window. They decided that what they had seen in that stained glass window was the face of something inhuman like a demon. Combine the face of a demon peering menacingly at you through red, blue, and yellow paints depicting a religious scene with the menacing growls of something that sounded like a mean dog, and you may have something that could definitely scare someone into a religious job or becoming a paranormal author, or both. A shape-shifting dogman. Could that be that what Vic Harbord and Christine Townsend saw at St. Lawrence churches in Atwick? Now that they've left the hobgoblin out of the bag, perhaps it's time to go back for another visit. This time have the cameras and recorders ready. That's way out there. But you know what? Sometimes, especially when some people could say, well, how could this hobgoblin or demon, whatever it is, exist not only in the churchyard, but obviously they're describing where it's in the church. And people don't realize, and I'm not saying whether this is valid or not. I have no idea what it is that they saw, if they saw it, whatever. But in other moments where people or paranormal groups have described similar sightings, people don't realize that a lot of times rituals are done precisely in churches. They basically have deconsecrated. They've somehow or other they've gained access into the church, all right, and done rituals to invoke certain beings, all right, and basically it's like a desecration of the church, and sometimes they're not aware of it. The whoever, whatever, whichever church. As a matter of fact, you will have a lot of churches that are, that are, that the congregation moves away or they abandon or they go somewhere else. They're very high on the I want that on the list of people that are into dark ritual practices. Even though it might be a church that's no longer in use, that is their preferred meeting place for coven gatherings and rituals is inside a church. So that's not as far-fetched as it sounds. So anyway, guys, I hope you really like this, and I will be back with you soon with a lot more interesting stories of the Eerie. Till then, take care.